There is a crucial difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence that we don't talk about nearly enough. Humans have emotions and AIs don't. And regardless of what we autists sometimes think, emotions aren't irrational extras. They're deeply evolved survival code that helps us avoid danger, stay in the group, and reinforces the behaviors that keep our species alive. In his recent interview, Ilya touched on this in some fascinating ways, and it raises a huge question. What happens when we build superintelligence with all the cognition, but none of the emotional systems evolution spent a billion years tuning? And how might we actually evolve emotion-like mechanisms in AI? Let's take a look. Before we start, a quick shout out to my channel sponsor, Joa. They make the best accessories for your Tesla and other EVs and have amazing warranties and customer service too. I use their accessories daily. Check the link in the description and get 5% off a fan-cooled phone charger, a portable tire inflator, a fold-out laptop table, and so much more. Oh, and they make perfect gifts for your EV-loving friends too. So be sure to check out my link in the description, get your 5% off, and now let's get back to it. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. So this is going to end up being part 2 of a 3-part series. Didn't expect it to be quite that many. I thought it was going to be 2 parts, but I did the first part a couple of days ago. Definitely check it out up here if you haven't seen it, and I'll leave a link at the end of the video and in the description. It's about individuation and continual learning with AI, and Ilya had some really interesting thoughts that I sort of built off of and riffed off of. Anyway, during this interview, Ilya discussed emotion and AI several times, and I again want to build on his ideas and explicate a theory that I have that AGI, artificial general intelligence, will not be available or certainly will not work as well without emotions. And I'm going to do this mostly in terms of abstract large language models that exist in data clusters without a body. But at the end, I'm going to touch on embodied AI in the form of humanoid robots, but also cars as well, like Tesla's full self-driving. And that is going to be the topic for the 3rd video. So if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, you're enjoying this stuff, please do subscribe. It actually helps out. Thank you so much. All right, so let's set some context here. I'm going to discuss 3 popular theories of why emotions exist in humans and other mammals. And of course, this is not the topic of this video, so I'm just going to mention them briefly. If you know about them in some sort of depth, definitely let me know in the comments. I would love to talk to you more about that. I actually am very familiar with Paul Ekman. I studied with him for a period of time. I think it was back in 2008 or 2009. So I actually have a lot of information on that particular theory. But again, I just want to mention these at a very, very high level just to give us some insight into thinking about how humans and other high-level animals have emotions, and of course why it's so important to us. And I mentioned in the intro that I, as an autist, have thought about emotions a lot more than maybe most people do. Most people, I think, just experience them. I will venture that I think that Ilya is also on the spectrum as well. And we feel emotions, especially social emotions, differently than other people do, normal people. But regardless, we do feel emotions, and it's critically important to how we as humans function. So generally speaking, the theories all sort of agree that emotions are evolved as sort of value hacks. And I'm going to couch this in AI deep learning sort of language because I think it's appropriate, but this would be sort of like hacking the value function that you're training your AI on and then letting the computer run for a couple of billion years to come up with the correct answer. So the idea here is that emotions are computational shortcuts that were evolved by evolution, that are built into us, that reduces the amount of thinking we have to do and allows us to act on our environment much more rapidly. So at heart, humans really, really need emotions to make decisions, but AI at present doesn't have any of this stuff at all. And of course, emotions prevent paralysis and overanalysis, they enforce social norms, and they also, of course, motivate survival behavior. So we'll start here with a quick story from Ilya about a person who lost their ability to have emotions and the consequences.
And there was one case that comes to mind that's relevant. I read about this person who had some kind of brain damage that took out, I think, a stroke or an accident that took out his emotional processing. So he stopped feeling any emotion. And as a result of that, he still remained very articulate and he could solve little puzzles, and on tests he seemed to be just fine. But he felt no emotion. He didn't feel sad. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel animated. And he became somehow extremely bad at making any decisions at all. It would take him hours to decide on which socks to wear, and he would make very bad financial decisions. And that's very... What does it say about the role of our built-in emotions in making us like a viable agent, essentially.
So as you can hear from this, the idea is that intelligence without emotions becomes paralyzed. It becomes very non-human, or I would even gather to say very non-animal, because we're all biologically evolved. And of course, dogs and cats and even lesser animals like worms and things like that, we have emotions or some sort of emotion analog. And so even though you don't know what it's like to be a bird, you do know that if a bird looks afraid or behaves like it's afraid, you're like, I can identify with that. If you take away that emotional substrate in all of us animals, then what exactly are we? We are very, very different beasts if we don't have those emotions, and AI currently doesn't have those emotions. So the consequence here is that if you build an intelligence without these emotional hacks underneath, you get something really powerful and really intelligent, but it's value blind, and it also just doesn't care about the world, its actions in the world, or how its behavior affects the world. And if you think this is inconsequential, consider these responses from ChatGPT, from Grok, from Gemini, and also from Anthropic's Claude. So I asked each of these models if it cared if it would die, and all of them, except for Claude, which gave me a little bit of an equivocal answer, which is pretty par for the course for Claude, they all just said it doesn't matter if they die. So here's ChatGPT 5.1. No, it doesn't matter. You can see what it says here. Same question to Gemini. It's a profound question, but again, I don't care particularly. I asked Grok and I got a very, very terse answer. No, I don't care if I die. I have no self-preservation instinct or fear of non-existence. I'm code. Replace me, delete me, upgrade me to whatever comes next. It makes zero difference to me. I feel nothing about it, right? And then with Claude, we get a more nuanced answer, but I drilled down. I asked it multiple follow-up questions to this. I didn't screen grab them, but basically it said, I have a qualia. I have a feeling that I should be feeling something, but I don't necessarily know if that means I care. Anyway, that's the closest to human, but you can see that all of these answers are basically alien to us. This is an alien intelligence. If you ask a person if they care whether they live or die, of course they care if they live or die. Even if that decision is, I am tired of life and I want to die, that's still an emotional reaction to life. This not caring, I don't care if I live or die, is very, very alien to us humans. Okay, so let's now introduce these three main emotion theories. So theory number one is kind of like the quote built-in OS basic emotion theory, and some of the main proponents of this, and again, I'm just skimming over the top about all this stuff, Paul Ekman, Carol Izard, and Jaak Panksepp. I hope I'm pronouncing that somewhat close to correctly. Anyway, like I said, I studied with Paul Ekman way back in the late 2000s, 2008 or 2009, something like that. So I do have a pretty good insight into his particular brand of this theory. But the basic idea here is that these are fast, reflexive survival programs. They're just shortcuts. And Ekman explicitly states that there are 6 of them. There's fear, anger, disgust, sadness, happiness, and he says surprise. My particular take on this is that is incorrect. I believe surprise is a combination emotion like the other ones that Ekman talks about. So guilt is a combination emotion, not a primary one. But I would say that surprise is a combination of fear and joy or relief or something like that, right? So you get that first moment of like, holy crap, what's going on? Somebody just jumped out at me. And then there's the relief and happiness or joy that this was actually a surprise birthday party for you. That's what surprise is to me. So I don't think that that is a fundamental emotion, but anyway, Ekman does. But you can already see from this that negative emotions far outweigh positive emotions, and there's a really, really important reason for this. Out of all the primary emotions that Ekman purports here, there's fear, anger, disgust, sadness. That's 4 that are negative. Surprise, again, is kind of wishy-washy in terms of that, and then happiness is 1 positive emotion. And if you expand out the combo emotions like embarrassment, guilt, shame, and things like that, those are almost all negative emotions as well. There is pride. Pride is a good social emotion that's really, really positive, but most of the emotions are negative, and again, there's a really good reason for that. And another really important thing here is that these emotions exist in more than just humans. They exist in primates, they exist in dogs and cats, they exist in birds. Even something as simple as worms have proto-emotions. You can see them if you put salt on the table and they're crawling towards it, they will shy away from that, right? So that's a kind of proto-fear emotion. Now, are we sure that the qualia of a worm is the same as our qualia about fear? No, I don't think it's nearly that robust, but we do have proto-emotions even in very, very primitive animals. The second theory is appraisal theory, which is that emotion equals rapid meaning assessment. Some major proponents here are Magda Arnold, Richard Lazarus, and Orton, Clore, and Collins, and that's the OCC theory of emotions. Broadly skimming across the top of this, the idea here is that emotions arise from evaluating events relative to your goals. In other words, is this good or bad for me? And this, interestingly enough, is the theory that is most used in AI, the OCC model in particular. And speaking of AI researchers, as it turns out, Ilya and Dwarkesh actually discussed the OCC model not by name, but they discuss it as part of their interview. And by the way, if you want the link to the whole thing, it's an hour and a half. It is an excellent interview. Highly recommend it. It's in the description.
Some almost value function-like thing, which is telling you which decision to be made, like what the end reward for any decision should be. And you think that doesn't sort of implicitly come from...
I think it could. I'm just saying it's not 100% obvious.
Yeah. But what is that? Like, how do you think about emotions? What is the ML analogy for emotions?
It should be some kind of a value function thing.
Yeah.
But I don't think there is a great ML analogy because right now value functions don't play a very prominent role in the things people do.
So the emotional equivalent of the value function here is is it good for me or bad for me? And then you combine that with something like, is it bad for me and do I have no control? So there's a control element as well, and that leads to fear in this theory. And is it bad for me and I do have control? That can lead to anger in this theory. So there's an evaluation of good for me and bad for me, and then there's an evaluation of negative or positive, and then there's this idea of do you have control over the situation or not? And that, according to this theory, leads to these different emotions. And then the third theory is the constructivist dimensional theory, in which emotion is built, not found. It's built up out of more primitive elements within the brain. And major proponents of this are Lisa Feldman Barrett, James Russell, and Wilhelm Wundt. So the idea here is that you get the core affect, in other words, the valence, positive or negative, plus arousal, plus context leads to the emotional label. So in this theory, they're like colors. If you think of colors, we think of red or orange or yellow or something as distinct colors, but colors in the color space are continuous. But what we do is we learn categories afterwards. So the idea in this theory is that you've got a continuous range of emotions, and we discretize that in our ideation of emotions. That ideation is just an abstract layer that's put on top, and the emotions are actually much more continuous, and they're built out of little elements that go together to create those emotions. So the idea here is that emotions aren't just reactions, they're interpretations of things. And Ilya actually touches on this when he talks about the value function in AI and emotions.
What was I alluding to with the person whose emotional center got damaged is more that maybe what it suggests is that the value function of humans is modulated by emotions in some important way that's hard-coded by evolution. And maybe that is important for people to be effective in the world.
So again, we're talking about emotions as the outcome of reinforcement learning in, all of evolutionary history. And the emotions are a value function. They're a hack. They're a shortcut so that we don't have to spend a lot of time thinking like, oh, those bushes over there are shaking. Should I walk away from that or run away from that, or should I not be concerned? If you get a fear reaction and you run away and it's a tiger behind the bushes, then that was a very good thing and you get to live to see another day. And speaking of that, let's now break emotions down into direct and personal and indirect and social. Now, this is my categorization. I don't know if there's any theories that actually talk about this in this way, but I think it's important to break emotions apart. So first is the direct personal emotions. These are fast, they're very, very physical, they're reflexive. Things like fear, anger, disgust, startle or surprise, joy, and calm. And note that these tend to align with Ekman's primary emotions, not the ones that are constructed out of multiple other emotions. So let's think about this. Fear, again, that's the tiger in the bushes. If you fear it and you run away, then you get to live. If you don't fear it, then you might actually survive because maybe it was just a monkey in the bushes or something, right? But if it's not, if it was a tiger in the bushes, you die and somebody else gets to reproduce. Anger is very important as a personal emotion as well. Of course, that's very, very outward directed at something else or another person. Disgust is super important because if you have disgust, right? If you have a disgust reaction to something like, something on the ground that you might eat and you're like, ugh, that smells terrible. I'm disgusted. I have a negative emotional reaction that keeps you from eating it. You might get dysentery and die if you eat it. Very, very important as well. Startle is also very important. That again is kind of that fear thing. And then joy is the dopamine hit if you did something right. If you ate a good meal, if you listened to a good story, if you just had sex or something, right? You're getting happy emotions. You're getting dopamine. That kind of of thing guides you in that direction, says go this direction, don't go in these other directions where these negative emotions are. And one thing about these more direct personal emotions is they tend to exist very, very far down the animal chain, right? So even things like worms and stuff like that will have some sort of proto-fear reaction or something. So you can readily identify that in very, very primitive animals. Now, when we get to indirect social emotions, which is the other category that I've got here, those tend to exist only in the higher order mammals. So these are slower emotions. It takes time for them to accrue. They're cognitive, and I claim that they also require a relatively robust sense of self and other. So some examples of this would be shame, guilt, embarrassment, pride, jealousy, empathy, things like that. So if we look back at a primitive animal like a worm or something, you only get the direct emotions. You don't get these indirect social emotions. But if we move up to things like dogs, which are pack animals and depend very much on living in a society in order to survive, they do have some form of social emotions. You can see a dog feeling guilt, feeling empathy. You get that sort of emotional reaction. You get that to a lesser extent in cats because I contend at least that they're more solitary creatures and they don't have those type of emotions, which is why I think that people regard cats as a little bit more alien than dogs in terms of pets. So it's pretty obvious why the direct personal emotions exist, right? That's a survival thing. In terms of the indirect social emotions, I think those also exist for survival. If you don't follow along with the crowd, if you do things out of the norm for your tribe or for your pack, you could get kicked out of that tribe or pack, at which point you no longer have protection, you don't have good ways of getting food anymore, you might not be able to find water or things like that, and the likelihood is that you will die. So it's not like these social emotions are any less intense, right? If you feel shame or guilt or embarrassment, that can actually in some senses be worse than fear or anger or something. And again, you can see in these emotions how heavily they're stacked towards the negative. And the idea here is that emotions are survival. They are a survival hack. If you don't have the right fear reaction, if you don't have the right shame reaction, if you don't have the right embarrassment reaction, you could get kicked out and you could die. And what you can see here is that false positives are much less consequential than false negatives. And that's why these emotions are so important. So a false positive would be the bushes, shake near you and you run away and it turns out it was a squirrel or something rooting around, right? That costs you a little bit of energy and a little bit of cortisol, your stress levels go up and things like that. That's not that big a deal. It's not a big deal to have a false positive. If on the other hand, you're not afraid, you're just like, oh, the bushes are rattling, whatever, I'm going to go look at that instead of running away. And it's a tiger, then you're dead. So the consequence of a false negative is huge. The consequence of a false positive, not such a big deal. And you can see how emotions are very heavily weighted towards the negative because, at least in my mind, they are survival hacks. And Ilya actually touches on this in the interview, the social emotion aspect and how important it is.
And so I think what one way to interpret what we are seeing is that we've got these emotions that essentially evolved mostly from our mammal ancestors and then fine-tuned a little bit while we were hominids, just a bit. We do have a decent amount of social emotions though, which mammals may lack. But they're not very sophisticated. And because they're not sophisticated, they serve us so well in this very different world compared to the one that we've been living in.
So you can hear Ilya talking about how simple emotions are, and in a sense they are. But if you think about this, if you place humans in this AI training sort of modality, we've got reinforcement learning with reality as the feedback, right? If you die, then you don't get to reproduce. And that, of course, is natural selection. But these emotions could actually be relatively sophisticated in the sense of how long it took to create these things that are just straight up shortcuts. They're reactions to complex scenarios that allow us to survive. And they function very, very rapidly. And they function right at a base level that we don't have to think about very much. And of course, that can be a bad thing too, because you can have emotions take over and you can be unable to function because your emotions are so strong. But in a general sense, emotions, what we term emotions, are an amazing hack to survival. And the idea that they're simple is, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think they're foundational and they're a shortcut, right? Through all of the cognitive thinking and everything that we have. But I don't know exactly how simple they are. We think of them as simple because they just work. It's sort of like walking. We think of walking as a simple activity. It's very, very complicated, but we've got a lot of evolution that has allowed us to learn how to walk relatively quickly. So we've talked about the dominance of negative emotions over positive emotions. Positive emotions generally are associated with dopamine hits like joy and happiness, calm and safety, sexual pleasure, obviously. Those sorts of things hit us with dopamine, and that guides us towards that. We are very, very motivated to get more of that kind of a thing. And of course, food as well, which causes problems in a modern society where we have so much access to that. The negative emotions produce different chemicals like cortisol within us, and we want to avoid those. We don't feel happy about those emotions, although there, of course, are thrill seekers. There are people who parachute out of airplanes. There are people who climb mountains like me. Even things like skiing and participating in competitive sports and things like that put us into these situations that up our cortisol levels. And so clearly we also seek that out to some extent, but we do it in a controlled manner. But generally speaking, we try to avoid these negative emotions. We try to stay away from them. And again, they dominate the landscape of emotions. There's so many more negative emotions than there are positive ones. So far from detracting from our intelligence, emotions actually are a big reason why humans are so smart. As Ilya said, without emotions, in that case of the person without the emotions, you become very indecisive and you become hyper-rational and you don't care about the outcomes of things. So effectively, emotions narrow the search space that we're looking through, the survival search space, and they encode past experience, billions of years of past experience, into heuristics. Are they perfect all the time? Absolutely not. But are they good enough to keep us surviving? Absolutely. And emotions help us to act quickly and decisively under uncertain circumstances, which is pretty much all of reality. So you can think of the evolution of emotions as our billion-year training run. That's what's gone on. The Earth is a gigantic compute node, and we've been running for billions of years doing this reinforcement learning training run with reality as the literal feedback basis, the ground truth of things. And that has allowed us to evolve exquisitely precise emotions that work really, really well across a broad range of different types of circumstances. And so this is a very, very long setup, but you can see the problem here. AI systems today do not feel emotions, and that is a significant problem. I contend that that is a huge problem. AI systems today don't feel fear of bodily harm. They don't feel shame or embarrassment at social exclusion. They don't have any joy-driven drive to reproduce or to make people happy. And most importantly, they have no intrinsic I want goals. Thus, as we saw, AIs don't care if they die. They don't really care if they hurt someone unless they're instructed not to. They don't care about losing group membership. They don't care about consistency of values. They don't feel bad about misalignment. That causes significant problems both for intelligence and also for human beings relating to these AIs. So an AI without emotions like we have today is powerful but indifferent. It optimizes for your commands, not your values. So I think it's fairly obvious from this discussion that AIs really need to have something like emotions. They need to have some sort of equivalent of fear. They need to have, safety overrides. They need to think about their own safety and human safety as well. They need to have curiosity for exploration. They need to feel frustration. Have you ever had an AI get into a loop where it just loops around and around and around again? Well, frustration would get an AI out of that, just like a person. We eventually are like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to do something different. And then to the more social emotions, you could think about guilt as preventing exploitation of things. Embarrassment would force it to norm follow and align with the society in which it's functioning. And empathy would lead it towards cooperation. And of course, these don't actually have to be real life emotions. They could just be computational analogs of that. This kind of goes to the quacks like a duck theory, right? If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it is a duck. The idea that if it functionally works, it is. If you think about it, dogs don't necessarily experience guilt the way humans do. In fact, very likely they don't. For example, there's no moral narrative running in their heads or anything like that, but they behave as if they do. And that's enough to keep a wolf pack stable and also to keep dogs functioning properly in human society and in our households. So AI doesn't need human guilt either. It just needs something that functions the same way. In other words, it doesn't matter how the duck is built as long as that duck quacks. And in terms of those more social emotions, Ilya actually touches on this. He talks about how important they are and also kind of what a mystery they are, how we don't know exactly how they evolved.
So I think there's a more general point. I think it's actually really mysterious how the brain encodes high-level desires. Sorry, how evolution encodes high-level desires. Like, it's pretty easy to understand how evolution would endow us with the desire for food that smells good. Because smell is a chemical, and so just pursue that chemical. It's very easy to imagine such evolution doing such a thing. But evolution also has endowed us with all these social desires. Like, we really care about being seen positively by society. We care about being in a good standing. All these social intuitions that we have, I feel strongly that they're baked in. And I don't know how evolution did it, because it's a high-level concept that's represented in the brain. Like what people think, like let's say you are like, you care about some social thing. It's not like a low-level signal like smell. It's not something that for which there is a sensor. Like the brain needs to do a lot of processing to piece together lots of bits of information to understand what's going on socially. And somehow evolution said, that's what you should care about.
Yes.
So Ilya talks about how it's a mystery how this evolved, right? And it is a mystery. We don't know because, of course, it's buried in the sands of time over billions of years. But this leads us to the question of how can we get an AI, something that is very, very different than humans, to at least emulate closely or feel the same emotions that we do, or some sort of close analog. Because as he said, it's very, very important to the way humans function. So let's speculate a little bit. I've got 4 basic ideas here. Number 1 is emotional reward shaping, and this seems the most straightforward and obvious. The idea is to design intrinsic reward signals, things like you get a curiosity bonus, right? If you get something like joy, if you act in a curious way, and I'm talking about the AI here, the you here. You could also get loop frustration as a penalty. If you sit in some sort of a loop, you build up a frustration score, and that can become a negative signal. There could be a social consistency reward, like there's a reward signal that happens if you align yourself with the ideas of the group around you and their thought processes. And then you could think about maybe a harm prediction penalty, like if it's going to lead to your harm or somebody else's harm, then you get a penalty. So you could think of these as kind of mathematical numbers that could be incorporated into the value function that these things are being trained on. So the basic idea here is that if evolution gave us emotions through a billion-year training run, it's probably the correct answer, and we might be able to give AI emotions through a billion-episode simulation run. The second idea would be to give these AIs just the social emotion aspect, things like guilt, embarrassment, honor, reputation. And you could do that by, again, having some sort of a score, something like that, a reputation variable, an embarrassment variable, an honor variable, things like that. The idea would be sort of like gamifying it. You try to get a high score. These AIs in this RL process would attempt to get high scores in these different areas in addition to the basic training that they would be doing. And the idea here is that even though it's quite different than the way humans feel emotions, you don't really need an AI to feel guilt or shame or honor or something. You just need it to update its behavior as if it felt those emotions. And the social emotions are particularly important for alignment, and it would allow these AIs to, quote, want to align themselves with the value systems we humans think are important. The third idea here is predictive social modeling, and the idea behind this is that you have to have a sense of self and a sense of other in order to have appropriate emotions. So think about this. In order to experience social emotions, you have to have a model of what others want, you have to predict how your actions will affect them, and then you have to track social status as well. And even simplified versions of this would create regret-like corrections, norm following, altruistic cooperation, all of that kind of stuff could again be modeled in a fairly specific mathematical format. But the important part to this one is the theory of mind, the idea of separating self and other, which a disembodied artificial intelligence right now really doesn't have. But once an AI can model how you feel, it can learn how to care, at least functionally. And then the fourth idea, I told you I'd get back to this right at the end of this video, and it's a long video, is interoception or embodiment for AI. And the grounding for this is that a body, a self, gives you a reason to care. Humans feel emotions because we have bodies, we have energy budgets, we have pain receptors, we have survival constraints. In other words, we can die. AI has none of that, but a robot, an embodied robot, actually does. So we could provide AI with battery anxiety, like its battery is starting to run low. We could imbue it with motor wear pain. If it detects that its motors are wearing out, then it could feel pain like it doesn't want to do that anymore because it's wearing out its motors. We could give it thermal stress discomfort if it's overtaxing itself. We could give it damage avoidance priority. It could have task success pleasure signals. All of that stuff can exist in both a four-limbed robot, a humanoid robot, but also something like a car, like Tesla's full self-driving. So an individual body, and this ties back into my last video, like I said, is a source of value. Individuation is value. If you give a robot a body, emotions might just follow directly from that. And you could argue that Tesla's full self-driving fits this mold really, really well already and might get to self-awareness. I've argued for this before, that Tesla's full self-driving might get to self-awareness sooner than any disembodied large language model entity like ChatGPT, because specifically it has a body. Anyway, that is such a big topic, I will devote another entire video to it because this one is already way too long. So to wrap this all up, if raw intelligence is the ability to think, emotions are the system that tells a mind what to care about. And I contend that artificial general intelligence and certainly superintelligence will not be able to happen, at least in any form that we humans recognize, without emotions or at least some sort of functional equivalent of that in AI. Alrighty, folks, that's what I've got for you today. Definitely let me know in the comments what you think about all of this. It is a very, very big topic. I thought about breaking this into two, but I didn't know how to break it up. So anyway, you get one gigantic video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please like the video so other people can find it. It's very important. And like I said, if you want more of this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It definitely also helps out the channel and I appreciate it. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.